The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 11, Side 2. It is in the nature of an empire to disintegrate soon, for the energy that created it disappears from those who inherit it, at the very time that its subject peoples are gathering strength to fight for their lost liberty. Nor is it natural that nations diverse in language, religion, morals, and traditions should long remain united. There is nothing organic in such a union, and compulsion must repeatedly be applied to maintain the artificial bond. In its 200 years of empire, Persia did nothing to lessen this heterogeneity, these centrifugal forces. She was content to rule a mob of nations, and never thought of making them into a state. Year by year the union became more difficult to preserve. As the vigor of the emperors relaxed, the boldness and ambition of the satraps grew. They purchased or intimidated the generals and secretaries who were supposed to share and limit their power. They arbitrarily enlarged their armies and revenues, and engaged in recurrent plots against the king. The frequency of revolt and war exhausted the vitality of Little Persia. The braver stocks were slaughtered in battle after battle, until none but the cautious survived, and when these were conscripted to face Alexander, they proved to be cowards almost to a man. No improvements had been made in the training or equipment of the troops or in the tactics of the generals. These blundered childishly against Alexander, while their disorderly ranks, armed mostly with darts, proved to be mere targets for the long spears and solid phalanxes of the Macedonians. Alexander frolicked, but only after the battle was won. The Persian leaders brought their concubines with them and had no ambition for war. The only real soldiers in the Persian army were the Greeks. From the day when Xerxes turned back defeated from Salamis, it became evident that Greece would one day challenge the empire. Persia controlled one end of the great trade route that bound Western Asia with the Mediterranean. Greece controlled the other, and the ancient acquisitiveness and ambition of men made such a situation provocative of war. As soon as Greece found a master who could give her unity, she would attack. Alexander crossed the Hellespont without opposition, having what seemed to Asia a negligible force of 30,000 footmen and 5,000 cavalry. A Persian army of 40,000 troops tried to stop him at Granicus. The Greeks lost 115 men, the Persians 20,000. Alexander marched south and east, taking cities and receiving surrenders for a year. Meanwhile, Darius III gathered a horde of 600,000 soldiers and adventurers. 5 days were required to march them over a bridge of boats across the Euphrates. 600 mules and 300 camels were needed to carry the royal purse. When the two armies met at Issus, Alexander had no more than 30,000 followers. But Darius, with all the stupidity that destiny could require, had chosen a field in which only a small part of his multitude could fight at one time. When the slaughter was over, the Macedonians had lost some 450, the Persians 110,000 men, most of these being slain in wild retreat. Alexander, in reckless pursuit, crossed a stream on a bridge of Persian corpses. Darius fled ignominiously, abandoning his mother, a wife, 2 daughters, his chariot, and his luxuriously appointed tent. Alexander treated the Persian ladies with a chivalry that surprised the Greek historians, contenting himself with marrying one of the daughters. If we may believe Quintus Curtius, the mother of Darius became so fond of Alexander that after his death she put an end to her own life by voluntary starvation. The young conqueror turned aside now with what seemed foolhardy leisureliness to establish his control over all of Western Asia. He did not wish to advance farther without organizing his conquests and building a secure line of communications. The citizens of Babylon, like those of Jerusalem, came out en masse to welcome him, offering him their city and their gold. He accepted these graciously and pleased them by restoring the temples which the unwise Xerxes had destroyed. Darius sent him a proposal of peace, saying that he would give Alexander 10,000 talents for the safe return of his mother, his wife, and his children, would offer him his daughter in marriage, and would acknowledge his sovereignty over all Asia west of the Euphrates, if only Alexander would end the war and become his friend. Parmenio, second in command among the Greeks, said that if he were Alexander he would be glad to accept such happy terms and avoid with honor the hazard of some disastrous defeat. Alexander remarked that he would do likewise, if he were Parmenio. Being Alexander, he answered Darius that his offer meant nothing, since he, Alexander, already possessed such parts of Asia as Darius proposed to cede to him, and could marry the daughter of the emperor when he pleased. Darius, despairing of peace with so reckless a logician, turned unwillingly to the task of collecting another and larger force. Meanwhile, Alexander had taken Tyre and annexed Egypt. Now he marched back across the great empire, straight to its distant capitals. In 20 days from Babylon his army reached Susa, and took it without resistance. Thence it advanced so quickly to Persepolis that the guards of the royal treasury had no time to secrete its funds. There Alexander committed one of the most unworthy acts of his incredible career. Against the counsel of Parmenio, and we are told to please the courtesan Thais, he burned the palaces of Persepolis to the ground and permitted his troops to loot the city. Then, having raised the spirits of his army with booty and gifts, he turned north to meet Darius for the last time. Darius had gathered, chiefly from his eastern provinces, a new army of 1,000,000 men: Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Syrians, Armenians, Cappadocians, Bactrians, Sogdians, Arachosians, Saesai, and Hindus, and had equipped them no longer with bows and arrows, but with javelins, spears, shields, horses, elephants, and scythe-wielding chariots intended to mow down the enemy like wheat. With this vast force, old Asia would make one more effort to preserve itself from adolescent Europe. Alexander, with 7,000 cavalry and 40,000 infantry, met the motley mob at Gaugamela, and by superior weapons, generalship, and courage destroyed it in a day. Darius again chose the better part of valor, but his generals, disgusted with this second flight, murdered him in his tent. Alexander put to death such of the assassins as he could find, sent the body of Darius in state to Persepolis, and ordered it to be buried in the manner of the Achaemenid kings. The Persian people flocked readily to the standard of the conqueror, charmed by his generosity and his youth. Alexander organized Persia into a province of the Macedonian Empire, left a strong garrison to guard it, and marched on to India. Book 2. India and Her Neighbors. The highest truth is this: God is present in all beings. They are his multiple forms. There is no other God to seek. It is a man-making religion that we want. Give up these weakening mysticisms and be strong. For the next 50 years let all other gods disappear from our minds. This is the only God that is awake, our own race, everywhere his hands, everywhere his feet, everywhere his ears. He covers everything. The first of all worships is the worship of those all around us. He alone serves God who serves all other beings. Vivekananda. Chapter 14. The Foundations of India. 1. Scene of the drama. The rediscovery of India. A glance at the map. Climatic influences. Nothing should more deeply shame the modern student than the recency and inadequacy of his acquaintance with India. Here is a vast peninsula of nearly 2 million square miles, 2/3 as large as the United States and 20 times the size of its master, Great Britain. 320 million souls, more than in all North and South America combined, or 1/5 of the population of the earth. An impressive continuity of development and civilization, from Mohenjo-Daro, 2900 B.C., or earlier to Gandhi, Raman, and Tagore. Faiths compassing every stage, from barbarous idolatry to the most subtle and spiritual pantheism. Philosophers playing 1,000 variations on one monistic theme, from the Upanishads 8 centuries before Christ to Shankara 8 centuries after him. Scientists developing astronomy 3,000 years ago and winning Nobel Prizes in our own time. A democratic constitution of untraceable antiquity in the villages, and wise and beneficent rulers like Ashoka and Akbar in the capitals. Minstrels singing great epics almost as old as Homer, and poets holding world audiences today. Artists raising gigantic temples for Hindu gods from Tibet to Ceylon and from Cambodia to Java, or carving perfect palaces by the score for Mughal kings and queens. This is the India that patient scholarship is now opening up, like a new intellectual continent, to that Western mind which only yesterday thought civilization an exclusively European thing. The scene of the history is a great triangle narrowing down from the everlasting snows of the Himalayas to the eternal heat of Ceylon. In a corner at the left lies Persia, close akin to Vedic India in people, language, and gods. Following the northern frontier eastward, we strike Afghanistan. Here is Kandahar, the ancient Gandhara, where Greek and Hindu sculpture fused for a while and then parted, never to meet again. And north of it is Kabul, from which the Moslems and the Mughals made those bloody raids that gave them India for 1,000 years. Within the Indian frontier, a short day's ride from Kabul, is Peshawar, where the old northern habit of invading the south still persists. Note how near to India Russia comes, at the Pamirs and the passes of the Hindu Kush. Hereby will hang much politics. Directly at the northern tip of India is the province of Kashmir, whose very name recalls the ancient glory of India's textile crafts. South of it is the Punjab, that is, the land of the 5 rivers, with the great city of Lahore and Shimla, summer capital at the foot of the Himalayas, home of the snow. Through the western Punjab runs the mighty river Indus, 1,000 miles in length. Its name came from the native word for river, Sindhu, which the Persians, changing it to Hindu, applied to all northern India in their word Hindustan, that is, land of the rivers. Out of this Persian term Hindu, the invading Greeks made for us the word India. From the Punjab, the Jumna and the Ganges flow leisurely to the southeast. The Jumna waters the new capital at Delhi and mirrors the Taj Mahal at Agra. The Ganges broadens down to the holy city, Benares, washes 10 million devotees daily, and fertilizes with its dozen mouths the province of Bengal and the old British capital at Calcutta. Still farther east is Burma, with the golden pagodas of Rangoon and the sunlit road to Mandalay. From Mandalay back across India to the western airport at Karachi is almost as long a flight as from New York to Los Angeles. South of the Indus, on such a flight, one would pass over Rajputana, land of the heroic Rajputs, with its famed cities of Gwalior and Chittor, Jaipur, Ajmer, and Udaipur. South and west is the presidency or province of Bombay, with teeming cities at Surat, Ahmedabad, Bombay, and Pune. East and south lie the progressive native-ruled states of Hyderabad and Mysore, with picturesque capitals of the same names. On the west coast is Goa, on the eastern coast is Pondicherry, where the conquering British have left to the Portuguese and the French, respectively, a few square miles of territorial consolation. Along the Bay of Bengal, the Madras Presidency runs, with the well-governed city of Madras as its center, and the sublime and gloomy temples of Tanjore, Trichinopoly, Madura, and Rameshwaram, adorning its southern boundaries. And then Adam's Bridge, a reef of sunken islands, beckons us across the strait to Ceylon, where civilization flourished 1,600 years ago. All these are a little part of India. We must conceive it, then, not as a nation like Egypt, Babylonia, or England, but as a continent as populous and polyglot as Europe, and almost as varied in climate and race, in literature, philosophy, and art. The north is harassed by cold blasts from the Himalayas, and by the fogs that form when these blasts meet the southern sun. In the Punjab, the rivers have created great alluvial plains of unsurpassed fertility. But south of the river valleys the sun rules as an unchecked despot. The plains are dry and bare, and require for their fruitful tillage no mere husbandry, but an almost stupefying slavery. Englishmen do not stay in India more than 5 years at a time, and if 100,000 of them rule 3,000 times their number of Hindus, it is because they have not stayed there long enough. Here and there, constituting 1/5 of the land, the primitive jungle remains, a breeding place of tigers, leopards, wolves, and snakes. In the southern third, or Deccan, the heat is drier, or is tempered with breezes from the sea. But from Delhi to Ceylon, the dominating fact in India is heat. Heat that has weakened the physique, shortened the youth, and affected the quietest religion and philosophy of the inhabitants. The only relief from this heat is to sit still, to do nothing, to desire nothing. Or in the summer months the monsoon wind may bring cooling moisture and fertilizing rain from the sea. When the monsoon fails to blow, India starves and dreams of nirvana. 2. The oldest civilization? Prehistoric India, Mohenjo-Daro, its antiquity. In the days when historians supposed that history had begun with Greece, Europe gladly believed that India had been a hotbed of barbarism until the Aryan cousins of the European peoples had migrated from the shores of the Caspian to bring the arts and sciences to a savage and benighted peninsula. Recent researches have marred this comforting picture, as future researches will change the perspective of these pages. In India, as elsewhere, the beginnings of civilization are buried in the earth, and not all the spades of archaeology will ever quite exhume them. Remains of an old Stone Age fill many cases in the museums of Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, and Neolithic objects have been found in nearly every state. These, however, were cultures, not yet a civilization. In 1924, the world of scholarship was again aroused by news from India. Sir John Marshall announced that his Indian aides, R.D. Banerjee in particular, had discovered at Mohenjo-Daro, on the western bank of the lower Indus, remains of what seemed to be an older civilization than any yet known to historians. There and at Harappa, a few hundred miles to the north, 4 or 5 superimposed cities were excavated, with hundreds of solidly built brick houses and shops, ranged along wide streets as well as narrow lanes, and rising in many cases to several stories. Let Sir John estimate the age of these remains. These discoveries established the existence in Sindh, the northernmost province of the Bombay Presidency, and the Punjab, during the 4th and 3rd millennium B.C., of a highly developed city life, and the presence in many of the houses of wells and bathrooms as well as an elaborate drainage system betoken a social condition of the citizens at least equal to that found in Sumer, and superior to that prevailing in contemporary Babylonia and Egypt. Even at Ur, the houses are by no means equal in point of construction to those of Mohenjo-Daro. Among the finds at these sites were household utensils and toilet outfits, pottery painted and plain, hand-turned and turned on the wheel, terracottas, dice and chessmen, coins older than any previously known, over 1,000 seals, most of them engraved and inscribed in an unknown pictographic script, faience work of excellent quality, stone carving superior to that of the Sumerians, copper weapons and implements, and a copper model of a 2-wheeled cart, one of our oldest examples of a wheeled vehicle. Gold and silver bangles, ear ornaments, necklaces, and other jewelry, so well finished and so highly polished, says Marshall, that they might have come out of a Bond Street jeweler's of today rather than from a prehistoric house of 5,000 years ago. Strange to say, the lowest strata of these remains showed a more developed art than the upper layers, as if even the most ancient deposits were from a civilization already hundreds, perhaps thousands of years old. Some of the implements were of stone, some of copper, some of bronze, suggesting that this Indus culture had arisen in a Chalcolithic age, that is, in a transition from stone to bronze as the material of tools. The indications are that Mohenjo-Daro was at its height when Cheops built the first Great Pyramid, that it had commercial, religious, and artistic connections with Sumeria and Babylonia, and that it survived over 3,000 years until the 3rd century before Christ. We cannot tell yet whether, as Marshall believes, Mohenjo-Daro represents the oldest of all civilizations known. But the exhuming of prehistoric India has just begun. Only in our time has archaeology turned from Egypt across Mesopotamia to India. When the soil of India has been turned up like that of Egypt, we shall probably find there a civilization older than that which flowered out of the mud of the Nile. 3. The Indo-Aryans. The natives, the invaders, the village community, caste, warriors, priests, merchants, workers, outcasts. Despite the continuity of the remains in Sindh and Mysore, we feel that between the heyday of Mohenjo-Daro and the advent of the Aryans, a great gap stands in our knowledge, or rather, that our knowledge of the past is an occasional gap in our ignorance. Among the Indus relics is a peculiar seal composed of 2 serpent heads, which was the characteristic symbol of the oldest historic people of India, those serpent-worshipping Nagas, whom the invading Aryans found in possession of the northern provinces and whose descendants still linger in the remoter hills. Farther south, the land was occupied by a dark-skinned, broad-nosed people whom, without knowing the origin of the word, we called Dravidians. They were already a civilized people when the Aryans broke down upon them. Their adventurous merchants sailed the sea even to Sumeria and Babylon, and their cities knew many refinements and luxuries. It was from them, apparently, that the Aryans took their village community and their systems of land tenure and taxation. To this day, the Deccan is still essentially Dravidian in stock and customs, in language, literature, and arts. The invasion and conquest of these flourishing tribes by the Aryans was part of that ancient process whereby, periodically, the north is swept down violently upon the settled and pacified south. This has been one of the main streams of history on which civilizations have risen and fallen like epical undulations. The Aryans poured down upon the Dravidians, the Achaeans and Dorians upon the Cretans and Aegeans, the Germans upon the Romans, the Lombards upon the Italians, the English upon the world. Forever the North produces rulers and warriors, the South produces artists and saints, and the meek inherit heaven. Who were these marauding Aryans? They themselves used the term as meaning nobleman, Sanskrit Arya, noble. But perhaps this patriotic derivation is one of those afterthoughts which cast scandalous gleams of humor into philology. Very probably they came from that Caspian region which their Persian cousins called Aryanavaijo, the Aryan home. About the same time that the Aryan Kassites overran Babylonia, the Vedic Aryans began to enter India. Like the Germans invading Italy, these Aryans were rather immigrants than conquerors, but they brought with them strong physiques, a hearty appetite in both solids and liquids, a ready brutality, a skill and courage in war which soon gave them the mastery of northern India. They fought with bows and arrows, led by armored warriors in chariots, who wielded battle-axes and hurled spears. They were too primitive to be hypocrites. They subjugated India without pretending to elevate it. They wanted land and pasture for their cattle. Their word for war said nothing about national honor, but simply meant a desire for more cows. Slowly they made their way eastward along the Indus and the Ganges, until all Hindustan was under their control. As they passed from armed warfare to settled tillage, their tribes gradually coalesced into petty states. Each state was ruled by a king, checked by a council of warriors. Each tribe was led by a raja, or chieftain, limited in his power by a tribal council. Each tribe was composed of comparatively independent village communities governed by assemblies of family heads. Have you heard, Ananda, Buddha is represented as asking his St. John, that the Vajians foregather often and frequent public meetings of their clans? So long, Ananda, as the Vajians foregather thus often and frequent the public meetings of their clan, so long may they be expected not to decline, but to prosper. Like all peoples, the Aryans had rules of endogamy and exogamy, forbidden marriage outside the racial group or within near degrees of kinship. From these rules came the most characteristic of Hindu institutions. Outnumbered by a subject people whom they considered inferior to themselves, the Aryans foresaw that without restrictions on intermarriage they would soon lose their racial identity. In a century or two they would be assimilated and absorbed. The first caste division, therefore, was not by status, but by color. The early Hindu word for caste is varna, color. This was translated by the Portuguese invaders as casta, from the Latin castus, pure. It divided long noses from broad noses, Aryans from Nagas and Dravidians. It was merely the marriage regulation of an endogamous group. In its later profusion of heredity, racial, and occupational divisions, the caste system hardly existed in Vedic times. Among the Aryans themselves, marriage, except of near kin, was free, and status was not defined by birth. As Vedic India, 2000 to 1000 BC, passed into the heroic age, 1000 to 500 BC, that is, as India changed from the conditions pictured in the Vedas into those described in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, occupations became more specialized and hereditary, and caste divisions were more rigidly defined. At the top were the kshatriyas, or fighters, who held it a sin to die in bed. Even the religious ceremonials were in the early days performed by chieftains or kings, in the fashion of Caesar playing pontifex. The Brahmins or priests were then mere assistants at the sacrifice. In the Ramayana, a kshatriya protests passionately against mating a proud and peerless bride of warrior stock to a prating priest and Brahmin. The Jain books take for granted the leadership of the kshatriyas, and the Buddhist literature goes so far as to call the Brahmins low-born. Even in India, things change. But as war gradually gave way to peace, and as religion, being then largely an aid to agriculture in the face of the incalculable elements, grew in social importance and ritual complexity, and required expert intermediaries between men and gods, the Brahmins increased in number, wealth, and power. As educators of the young and oral transmitters of the race's history, literature, and laws, they were able to recreate the past and form the future in their own image, molding each generation into greater reverence for the priests, and building for their caste a prestige which would, in later centuries, give them the supreme place in Hindu society. Already in Buddha's days they had begun to challenge the supremacy of the kshatriyas. They pronounced these warriors inferior, even as the Kshatriyas pronounced the priests inferior. And Buddha felt that there was much to be said for both points of view. Even in Buddha's time, however, the Kshatriyas had not conceded intellectual leadership to the Brahmins, and the Buddhist movement itself, founded by a Kshatriya noble, contested the religious hegemony of India with the Brahmins for 1,000 years. Below these ruling minorities were the Vaisyas, merchants and freemen, hardly distinct as a caste before Buddha, the Shudras, or working men, who comprised most of the native population, and finally the outcasts, or pariahs, unconverted native tribes like the Chandalas, war captives, and men reduced to slavery as a punishment. Out of this originally small group of casteless men grew the 40 million untouchables of India today. 4. Indo-Aryan society. Herders, tillers of the soil, craftsmen, traders, coinage and credit, morals, marriage, woman. How did these Aryan Indians live? At first by war and spoliation, then by herding, tillage, and industry, in a rural routine not unlike that of medieval Europe. For until the Industrial Revolution in which we live, the basic economic and political life of man had remained essentially the same since Neolithic days. The Indo-Aryans raised cattle, used the cow without considering it sacred, and ate meat when they could afford it, having offered a morsel to priests or gods. Buddha, after nearly starving himself in his ascetic youth, seems to have died from a hearty meal of pork. They planted barley, but apparently knew nothing of rice in Vedic times. The fields were divided by each village community among its constituent families, but were irrigated in common. The land could not be sold to an outsider and could be bequeathed only to the family heirs in direct male line. The majority of the people were yeomen owning their own soil. The Aryans held it a disgrace to work for hire. There were, we are assured, no landlords and no paupers, no millionaires and no slums. In the towns, handicrafts flourished among independent artisans and apprentices, organized 1,000 years before Christ into powerful guilds of metal workers, woodworkers, stone workers, leather workers, ivory workers, basket makers, house painters, decorators, potters, dyers, fishermen, sailors, hunters, trappers, butchers, confectioners, barbers, shampooers, florists, cooks. The very list reveals the fullness and variety of Indo-Aryan life. The guilds settled intra-guild affairs, even arbitrating difficulties between members and their wives. Prices were determined, as among ourselves, not by supply and demand, but by the gullibility of the purchaser. In the palace of the king, however, was an official valuer who, like our secretive Bureau of Standards, tested goods to be bought and dictated terms to the makers. Trade and travel had advanced to the stage of horse and two-wheeled wagon, but were still medievally difficult. Caravans were held up by taxes at every petty frontier, and as like as not by highwaymen at any turn. Transport by river and sea was more developed. About 860 B.C., ships with modest sails and hundreds of oars carried to Mesopotamia, Arabia, and Egypt such typical Indian products as perfumes and spices, cotton and silk, shawls and muslins, pearls and rubies, ebony and precious stones, and ornate brocades of silver and gold. Trade was stunted by clumsy methods of exchange, at first by barter, then by the use of cattle as currency. Brides like Homer's oxen-bearing maidens were bought with cows. Later, a heavy copper coinage was issued, guaranteed, however, only by private individuals. There were no banks. Hoarded money was hidden in the house or buried in the ground or deposited with a friend. Out of this, in Buddha's age, grew a credit system. Merchants in different towns facilitated trade by giving one another letters of credit. Loans could be obtained from such Rothschilds at 18%, and there was much talk of promissory notes. The coinage was not sufficiently inconvenient to discourage gambling. Already dice were essential to civilization. In many cases, gambling halls were provided for his subjects by the king, in the fashion, if not quite in the style, of Monaco, and a portion of the receipts went to the royal treasury. It seems a scandalous arrangement to us who are not quite accustomed to having our gambling institutions contribute so directly to the support of our public officials. Commercial morality stood on a high level. The kings of Vedic India, as of Homeric Greece, were not above lifting cattle from their neighbors. But the Greek historian of Alexander's campaigns describes the Hindus as remarkable for integrity, so reasonable as seldom to have recourse to lawsuits, and so honest as to require neither locks to their doors nor writings to bind their agreements. They are in the highest degree truthful. The Rig Veda speaks of incest, seduction, prostitution, abortion, and adultery, and there are some signs of homosexuality, but the general picture that we derive from the Vedas and the epics is one of high standards in the relations of the sexes and the life of the family. Marriage might be entered into by forcible abduction of the bride, by purchase of her, or by mutual consent. Marriage by consent, however, was considered slightly disreputable. Women thought it more honorable to be bought and paid for, and a great compliment to be stolen. Polygamy was permitted and was encouraged among the great. It was an act of merit to support several wives and to transmit ability. The story of Draupadi, who married 5 brothers at once, indicates the occasional occurrence in epic days of that strange polyandry, the marriage of one woman to several men, usually brothers, which survived in Ceylon till 1859 and still lingers in the mountain villages of Tibet. But polygamy was usually the privilege of the male, who ruled the Aryan household with patriarchal omnipotence. He held the right of ownership over his wives and his children, and might in certain cases sell them or cast them out. Nevertheless, woman enjoyed far greater freedom in the Vedic period than in later India. She had more to say in the choice of her mate than the forms of marriage might suggest. She appeared freely at feasts and dances, and joined with men in religious sacrifice. She could study and might, like Gargi, engage in philosophic disputation. If she was left a widow, there were no restrictions upon her remarriage. In the heroic age, woman seems to have lost something of this liberty. She was discouraged from mental pursuits, on the ground that for a woman to study the Vedas indicates confusion in the realm. The remarriage of widows became uncommon. Purda, the seclusion of women, began, and the practice of sati, almost unknown in Vedic times, increased. The ideal woman was now typified in the heroine of the Ramayana, that faithful Sita who follows and obeys her husband humbly through every test of fidelity and courage until her death. 5. The religion of the Vedas. Pre-Vedic religion, Vedic gods, moral gods, the Vedic story of creation, immortality, the horse sacrifice. The oldest known religion of India, which the invading Aryans found among the Nagas and which still survives in the ethnic nooks and crannies of the great peninsula, was apparently an animistic and totemic worship of multitudinous spirits dwelling in stones and animals, in trees and streams, in mountains and stars. Snakes and serpents were divinities, idols and ideals of virile reproductive power, and the sacred Bodhi tree of Buddha's time was a vestige of the mystic but wholesome reverence for the quiet majesty of trees. Naga, the dragon god, Hanuman, the monkey god, Nandi, the divine bull, and the yakshas or tree gods passed down into the religion of historic India. Since some of these spirits were good and some evil, only great skill and magic could keep the body from being possessed or tortured, in sickness or mania, by one or more of the innumerable demons that filled the air. Hence the medley of incantations in the Atharva Veda, or Book of the Knowledge of Magic. One must recite spells to obtain children, to avoid abortion, to prolong life, to ward off evil, to woo sleep, to destroy or harass enemies. The earliest gods of the Vedas were the forces and elements of nature herself: sky, sun, earth, fire, light, wind, water, and sex. Dyaus, the Greek Zeus, the Roman Jupiter, was at first the sky itself, and the Sanskrit word deva, which later was to mean divine, originally meant only bright. By that poetic license which makes so many deities, these natural objects were personified. The sky, for example, became a father, Varuna. The earth became a mother, Prithvi. And vegetation was the fruit of their union through the rain. The rain was the god Parjanya, fire was Agni, the wind was Vayu, the pestilential wind was Rudra, the storm was Indra, the dawn was Ushas, the furrow in the field was Sita, the sun was Surya, Mitra, or Vishnu, and the sacred soma plant, whose juice was at once holy and intoxicating to gods and men, was itself a god, a Hindu Dionysus, inspiring man by its exhilarating essence to charity, insight, and joy, and even bestowing upon him eternal life. A nation, like an individual, begins with poetry and ends with prose, and as things became persons, so qualities became objects, adjectives became nouns, epithets became deities. The life-giving sun became a new sun god, Savitar the life-giver. The shining sun became Vivasvat, shining god. The life-generating sun became the great god Prajapati, lord of all living things. For a time the most important of the Vedic gods was Agni, fire. He was the sacred flame that lifted the sacrifice to heaven. He was the lightning that pranced through the sky. He was the fiery life and spirit of the world. But the most popular figure in the pantheon was Indra, wielder of thunder and storm. For Indra brought to the Indo-Aryans that precious rain, which seemed to them even more vital than the sun. Therefore they made him the greatest of the gods, invoked the aid of his thunderbolts in their battles, and pictured him enviously as a gigantic hero feasting on bulls by the hundred and lapping up lakes of wine. His favorite enemy was Krishna, who in the Vedas was as yet only the local god of the Krishna tribe. Vishnu, the sun who covered the earth with his strides, was also a subordinate god, unaware that the future belonged to him and to Krishna, his avatar. This is one value of the Vedas to us, that through them we see religion in the making and can follow the birth, growth, and death of gods and beliefs, from animism to philosophic pantheism, and from the superstition of the Atharva Veda to the sublime monism of the Upanishads. These gods are human in figure, in motive, almost in ignorance. One of them, besieged by prayers, ponders what he should give his devotee. "This is what I will do. No, not that. I will give him a cow. Or shall it be a horse? I wonder if I have really had soma from him." Some of them, however, rose in later Vedic days to a majestic moral significance. Varuna, who began as the encompassing heaven, whose breath was the storm and whose garment was the sky, grew with the development of his worshippers into the most ethical and ideal deity of the Vedas. Watching over the world through his great eye, the sun, punishing evil, rewarding good, and forgiving the sins of those who petitioned him. In this respect, Varuna was the custodian and executor of an eternal law called Rita. This was at first the law that established and maintained the stars in their courses. Gradually it became also the law of right, the cosmic and moral rhythm which every man must follow if he would not go astray and be destroyed. As the number of the gods increased, the question arose as to which of them had created the world. This primal role was assigned now to Agni, now to Indra, now to Soma, now to Prajapati. One of the Upanishads attributed the world to an irrepressible procreator. Verily he had no delight. One alone had no delight. He desired a second. He was indeed as large as a woman and a man closely embraced. He caused that self to fall into two pieces. Therefrom arose a husband and a wife. Therefore one's self is like a half-fragment. Therefore this space is filled by a wife. He copulated with her. Therefore human beings were produced. And she bethought herself, "How now does he copulate with me after he has produced me just from himself? Come, let me hide myself." She became a cow. He became a bull. With her he did indeed copulate. Then cattle were born. She became a mare, he a stallion. She became a female ass, he a male ass. With her he copulated of a truth. Thence were born solid-hoofed animals. She became a she-goat, he a he-goat, she a ewe, he a ram. With her he did verily copulate. Therefore were born goats and sheep. Thus indeed he created all, whatever pairs there are, even down to the ants. He knew, "I indeed am this creation, for I emitted it all from myself." Thence arose creation. In this unique passage, we have the germ of pantheism and transmigration. The Creator is one with his creation, and all things, all forms of life are one. Every form was once another form, and is distinguished from it only in the prejudice of perception and the superficial separateness of time. This view, though formulated in the Upanishads, was not yet in Vedic days a part of the popular creed. Instead of transmigration, the Indo-Aryans, like the Aryans of Persia, accepted a simple belief in personal immortality. After death, the soul entered into eternal punishment or happiness. It was thrust by Varuna into a dark abyss, half Hades and half hell, or was raised by Yama into a heaven, where every earthly joy was made endless and complete. Like corn decays the mortal, said the Katha Upanishad. Like corn is he born again. In the earlier Vedic religion there were, so far as the evidence goes, no temples and no images. Altars were put up anew for each sacrifice, as in Zoroastrian Persia, and sacred fire lifted the offering to heaven. Vestiges of human sacrifice occur here, as at the outset of almost every civilization, but they are few and uncertain. Again, as in Persia, the horse was sometimes burnt as an offering to the gods. The strangest ritual of all was the Ashvamedha, or sacrifice of the horse, in which the queen of the tribe seems to have copulated with the sacred horse after it had been killed. The usual offering was a libation of soma juice and the pouring of liquid butter into the fire. The sacrifice was conceived for the most part in magical terms. If it were properly performed, it would win its reward, regardless of the moral deserts of the worshipper. The priests charged heavily for helping the pious in the ever more complicated ritual of sacrifice. If no fee was at hand, the priest refused to recite the necessary formulas. His payment had to come before that of the god. Rules were laid down by the clergy as to what the remuneration should be for each service, how many cows or horses, how much gold. Gold was particularly efficacious in moving the priest or the god. The Brahmanas, written by the Brahmins, instructed the priest how to turn the prayer or sacrifice secretly to the hurt of those who had employed him if they had given him an inadequate fee. Other regulations were issued, prescribing the proper ceremony and usage for almost every occasion of life, and usually requiring priestly aid. Slowly the Brahmins became a privileged hereditary caste, holding the mental and spiritual life of India under a control that threatened to stifle all thought and change. 6. The Vedas as literature. Sanskrit and English, writing, the 4 Vedas, the Rig Veda, a hymn of creation. The language of the Indo-Aryans should be of special interest to us, for Sanskrit is one of the oldest in that Indo-European group of languages to which our own speech belongs. We feel for a moment a strange sense of cultural continuity across great stretches of time and space when we observe the similarity, in Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and English, of the numerals, the family terms, and those insinuating little words that, by some oversight of the moralists, have been called the copulative verb. It is quite unlikely that this ancient tongue, which Sir William Jones pronounced more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either, should have been the spoken language of the Aryan invaders. What that speech was, we do not know. We can only presume that it was a near relative of the early Persian dialect in which the Avesta was composed. The Sanskrit of the Vedas and the epics has already the earmarks of a classic and literary tongue, used only by scholars and priests. The very word Sanskrit means prepared, pure, perfect, sacred. The language of the people in the Vedic age was not one but many. Each tribe had its own Aryan dialect. India has never had one language. The Vedas contain no hint that writing was known to their authors. It was not until the 8th or 9th century B.C. that Hindu, probably Dravidian, merchants brought from Western Asia a Semitic script akin to the Phoenician, and from this Brahma script, as it came to be called, all the later alphabets of India were derived. For centuries, writing seems to have been confined to commercial and administrative purposes, with little thought of using it for literature. Merchants, not priests, developed this basic art. Even the Buddhist canon does not appear to have been written down before the 3rd century B.C. The oldest extant inscriptions in India are those of Ashoka. We who, until the Arabadus was filled with words and music, were for centuries made eye-minded by writing and print, find it hard to understand how contentedly India, long after she had learned to write, clung to the old ways of transmitting history and literature by recitation and memory. The Vedas and the epics were songs that grew with the generations of those that recited them. They were intended not for sight, but for sound. From this indifference to writing comes our dearth of knowledge about early India. What, then, were these Vedas from which nearly all our understanding of primitive India is derived? This book is continued on Cassette 12, Side 1.